Well, it's 7 o'clock, and I want to say welcome to SDS Thursday. And what a week we are having, huh? We've started these Thursdays in March, in the beginning of the first lockdown, when we didn't know that one day we will be saying, and today we are starting the second lockdown. It just all being quite a roller coaster, I guess. And this week as well, with watching what's happening across the pond, it's all been very emotional. We started it as a tool to bring us together, to bring like-minded people together, to give each other the sign that we're not alone. We are surrounded by people who are trying to do their best in these difficult circumstances. And I am very proud to say that this has been very popular. These events have been very popular. And we are continuing with them. And probably towards the end, I will ask some advice from you, or maybe I will ask you to write it in the chat box right now, in terms of who you would like to hear from, because we are inviting people who we know and who we have particular connections with. But maybe you've recently read a fantastic professional book, or attended another event and want to ask more questions, and all sorts of ideas. So if you have any ideas who you would want to meet during this SDS Thursdays, please write in the chat box. Or if you haven't joined our Facebook group, Therapy Toolkit, please join, and also I will put the same question there and comment there, because we are interested in meeting new people, inviting new people who might be of interest to you. So please share your ideas, and we'll do our best to get in touch with those authors or presenters, therapists, teachers, and invite them to talk to you during these events. So today we will be with Professor Paul Grantham, a co-director of SDS seminars, and he will be talking about Socratic questioning, which traditionally lots of people associate with cognitive behavioral therapy, but actually as a method, it is much more widely applicable to all sorts of psychotherapy modalities and counseling. So I am very happy to introduce Paul Grantham and leave you in his capable hands. I will look after the waiting room now. Paul, welcome.
Thanks very much, Judy. I'm glad you're going to be looking after the waiting room, because I've been clicking away here trying to let people in, and they're still coming in. Welcome, folks. Welcome to this particular evening. I sort of apologize in advance if you're going to hear sort of banging of fireworks behind me, but you obviously know why that actually is. I hope that that's not going to interfere with your enjoyment, and won't interfere with what I hope is going to be a sort of stimulating time for you, really. I wanted to say a little bit about Socratic questioning this evening. That is in advance of a 2-day experiential course that I'm running in a couple of weeks' time on the 17th and 18th of November. But to be honest with you, we've already found that that's been fully booked. So it's actually being repeated again on the 27th and 28th of January, of which there are still places there. I'm sure that if you are interested in this or want to get into it any further, I'm sure that Julia will pop up the website URL for you to get more information on this. Those 2 days, can I just emphasize, are deliberately designed as an experiential 2-day workshop. They're part of the BPS approved Master Practitioner Diploma in CBT. And they are, if I remember this right, one of the few purely experiential training events that we actually do during the course of the year. So it's being conducted on Zoom, obviously, but there will be a lot of pair work within it. And there's a particular reason why I wanted to do it in that particular way, was because if I can just talk about this from a CBT perspective in a minute, and I'll broaden it out from that afterwards. But from a CBT perspective, if you actually talk to accredited CBT therapists about what it is that they would have liked to have had more of during their training, the two things that tend to come out most commonly are Socratic questioning and case formulation. And there's a very strange thing about Socratic questioning, particularly again in CBT, but I would say I can probably make this statement generally actually within the psychotherapy field, which is that there is very, very little written about it. Helen Kennelly is probably the person at the Oxford Cognitive Therapy Centre who is probably most strongly associated with this in the UK. But I will be honest with you and say, to my knowledge, and I'm quite happy to be corrected on this, but to my knowledge, she has actually only written one chapter on this and also a fairly small book on it as well. It's quite amazing that for something which is so central, or is often described as being so central within CBT, that there is so little that's actually written about it. But as I said, this is something which is not unique to CBT. So to make a very, what I hope is a very obvious point, is it predates CBT. It's related obviously to Socrates, and the sort of archetypal story that is often told in connection with this is that Socrates used to hang around the Athenian marketplace and hide behind vegetable stalls, and would periodically jump out from behind a vegetable stall with a cabbage in his hand to an Athenian housewife and say, "What is this?" And they would say, "It's a cabbage," and to which he would then reply, "And how do you know that?" And that basic principle of what is it that we know and how do we know it is really the fundamental principle that describes what Socratic questioning is about. So in psychotherapeutic terms, it is probably first seen in Adlerian psychotherapy. So it's a sort of neo-Freudian idea that got adopted. And in terms of its introduction, I think, into CBT, I think that is a very Beckian influenced idea rather than Ellis influenced idea. And I think in turn, why in a sense did Beck introduce it, or what was it about it that led Beck to introduce it? And I think it had to do with the degree to which Beck was strongly influenced by Carl Rogers. So there is an automatic overlap between what might be broadly termed person-centered therapy and Socratic questioning, although I think in fairness, probably less has been written about it within the sort of person-centered literature than there has been written elsewhere. Probably where it's bedded in the most, and where you're going to find this talked about the most, is actually altogether outside the psychotherapy field. It probably is bedded in the most and is sort of known about the most within the education field, and particularly adult education, but it's a part of that sort of body of knowledge about how is it that we learn, really. And that's the fundamental principle about it, is it's designed as a learning technique or a learning strategy. So in terms of where it sort of fits in with not just CBT, I think, but with other psychotherapeutic modalities generally, is that it is about a way of having a conversation with a client which facilitates or enables the client to discover and understand specific things which are helpful for them in terms of personal change. So not surprisingly, it's overwhelmingly related to concepts of insight. It's clearly in the broadest sense of the term, a cognitive idea. And it uses a series of, surprise, with Socratic questioning, it uses a series of questions in order to enable the client to actually make these discoveries. So I think probably what I wanted to say in connection with that, first of all, is to really say what it's not. And although at one level saying what it's not is pretty straightforward, it's probably, I sort of know repeatedly from experience that whatever it is that people think that they are doing within psychotherapy, it is very, and they say when they initially come across Socratic questioning, aha, right, I know what's involved here, this looks straightforward, and they dive straight in. And then they start finding themselves, I think, gravitating towards, as occurs with all of us really, certain default ways of communicating. These are default ways of communicating which either sit comfortably with our own personalities, or they're default ways of communicating which may have come from our training as well, and which actually are not, either not quite on the button as far as Socratic questioning is concerned, or alternatively are actually the antithesis of it. But I think where somehow or other, sometimes people think that they're not actually doing the thing that they're actually doing, and that they're actually keeping to Socratic questioning when they're not. So what I thought I would do would be to just run through some of the things that people find themselves doing rather than using Socratic questioning, before I then go on a little bit further to say what it actually constitutes and what it consists of and how you might actually use it. So I think the thing that it stands most in antithesis against is undoubtedly advice giving. So it's the exact opposite of advice giving. It's the exact opposite of basically telling the client what to do. So there is, I think, a much stronger idea that the client in many ways needs to discover things for themselves. And why is that considered to be so important? I think it's considered to be so important for a variety of reasons. I think that first of all, it is all too easy for therapists to get it wrong, basically. Advice is cheap, and we think, don't we, because of our enormous life experience and training, I would hasten to add, that we actually, broadly speaking, have a better idea than other folks do about how to live their lives and what is the healthiest way of doing things, although, of course, we don't like to admit that too much. And that sort of fits in with what I've often talked about in many other contexts, I think, as a fetish, which I think that we have within the psychotherapy and behavior change field, a fetish of desperately wanting to educate people with our own knowledge. So it's the antithesis of advice giving, and sort of a sort of close relative of that as well, is that it is the antithesis, I think, as well, of clear information giving too. Now, that doesn't mean to say it can't be used with information giving, and certainly within CBT, psychoeducation is a key important component part of the therapy. However, I think that the key role that Socratic questioning plays here is what it's basically saying is that we can guide, and I'll come back to the issue of guiding in a minute, we can guide our clients in the direction of certain information. But ultimately, we need to help the client internalize that information, and of course, most importantly, help them to use the information, which is really the ultimate aim of this, by asking certain questions. And I guess what's probably more accurate for me to say is that Socratic questioning is the antithesis of didactic information giving. It's the exact opposite of basically saying X, Y, and Z are the things that are most helpful, and these are the things that you might consider doing. So there's that sort of side of things as well. I think the other thing that I think it's important to differentiate it from is simple reflection and simple open questioning. So reflection plays a role in this. I'll come back if we've got time to saying a little bit more about that later on. And obviously Socratic questioning uses a form of different types of open question. But I think the key thing to bear in mind about Socratic questioning, and I think probably it's the thing which differentiates it, certainly within a CBT context, from the way in which it might be used elsewhere, is that Socratic questioning is about helping the client to discover things by asking them questions which they come to answer themselves. But it's got a very clear idea in its head about where it is hoping to take the client to. In other words, the end is always in mind. You know, Socratic questioning is not an end in itself. It is probably best seen as a style of communication. It's probably best seen as a way of having a conversation with clients, but with an end in mind, which is sort of clear to both the practitioner and ultimately to the client as well. So within a CBT context, it's probably worth just, at least at this stage, briefly saying what that would boil down to. It would, and I'm going to go through these items very quickly here. I hope you appreciate that when we do the 2 days experiential, we will be breaking this down into a lot more detail. But it's first of all about focusing on and prioritizing a particular issue, looking for a recent manifestation of that, which is probably most commonly within CBT called a hot event, and looking for a particular belief off the back of that, and using that as the focus of the Socratic questioning conversation that then arises from it. So to give you a simple example of this, for instance, let's just have a think of a personal one. Yes, I was down in Tesco's a couple of days ago, and I went in there later than I was intending, because I had a whole variety of things where basically people were needing my attention on certain stuff. And I went into Tesco's, and I was feeling a bit annoyed with some of these conversations, or one in particular I'd had with someone. Anyway, I got to a particular shelf in Tesco's, and what it was that I wanted wasn't there. And I felt annoyed. And if you had sat me down and asked me what it was that had went through my mind at that precise point when I saw that shelf was empty and I felt annoyed, I would have probably have said, Fred, this is not his real name, by the way, Fred would have been really, really pleased to see that I was disappointed here. Now, if, and I do want to emphasize this, if that was the issue, or it related to the issue that I was in therapy about and wished to address, maybe my relationship with people generally, or with Fred in particular, then what my therapist would do within a CBT context would be maybe to take that particular cognition. If Fred was here now, he would love this fact. and that would become the focus of the discussion. So the aim, so you're going to say, well, what is the aim then of exploring that particular belief Socratically? It has two purposes, really, and can I just emphasize that both purposes are equally important. The first purpose is for the therapist to ask around that particular belief to make sure that they've got a full understanding of the meaning and significance of that to the client. And I mention that because I think that Socratic questioning is as much about understanding the client and how they actually think, rather than jumping in and making assumptions. I'll come back to assumptions in a minute, in order to get a broad view of what's actually going on here. Beyond that, the ultimate aim would be to encourage me, if I was a client, to examine that particular belief critically, I think, to look at it in detail through my therapist using Socratic questioning to basically check out the validity of that particular belief. And if that belief really at the end of the day doesn't stack up to the degree to which I initially tend to think it does, then what ends up happening is that I end up moderating or modifying that particular belief. And it's through that process of modification, and I'm going to jump ahead here and give you a hypothetical example of how that belief might modify. It might modify to something like, I find Fred very difficult, but it's unfair to think that he wants bad things to always happen to me, for instance, might be the modification we end up with. As a result of exploring that, what one would expect to happen would be that there would be a moderation in how I feel. If I was to have that particular thought or a similar thought again in future. In other words, I wouldn't be feeling, if I was feeling angry, for instance, or distressed or depressed as a result of that thought, the intensity and the strength of that feeling would moderate, and also as well, my behavior in connection with that would also moderate too. So I don't know, I mean, if for example, I left Tesco's and stormed out because I was in such a bad mood and decided, you know, my God, I'm going to go and have a few pints because what with lockdown just starting to occur, that's totally justified in view of what that Fred said to me and did to me. If I'd gone and done that, then one would also expect to see a moderation in my behavior. Maybe I just simply go home, or maybe I don't even leave Tesco's at all. I just move on to the next shelf and get the next thing I want to have. So in a sense, there's two purposes here for Socratic questioning. One is to get a fuller understanding. And probably I should add to that, by the way, not just understanding, but also validate the client's beliefs and the client's experience, and to communicate that validation. And then ultimately to help the client to critically examine it, and then as a result of that, to potentially moderate it and change it, and therefore change the way in which they feel and what they actually do. So that's a very truncated description of what this particular style is designed to do, but I hope it gives something of a flavor. So in that respect, it covers a number of things. As I've said earlier, it's a way of having a conversation. It's a communication style within therapy. It's also a technique as well, because obviously one of its aims is to actually moderate unhelpful beliefs. So in that respect, it can be viewed as a CBT technique, but it's something really which is or should be woven through the way in which we hold a conversation with our clients. So it's got some other purposes which are not, I don't think, so commonly highlighted, but it's probably worth just briefly mentioning some of these, because some of you may be listening to this and you might be thinking to yourself, this sounds like it could dovetail in to things like motivational interviewing. And indeed, although these are quite separate processes, I think it's probably worth saying that for any of you that use motivational interviewing in your work with clients, I think that Socratic questioning gives you some fine tuning on the way in which you moderate or change or finesse your MI questions. So that's one thing. And I think personally, and this is certainly the way in which I use it, I think as well it is a useful, broadly speaking, motivational tool, because it takes the client's beliefs seriously, because it's interested in looking at them and trying to understand them and encouraging the client to look at them and take them seriously. I think this is really, really useful if you've got clients who basically don't want to be there with you, or alternatively start off from the assumption that you're there to try and change them in some particular way. I think it's a way of building a collaborative relationship with your clients as well. And I think that's quite important. So that sort of naturally leads on to the, I guess, the how-to. How do you do this? And we will be looking at this in a lot more detail, not surprisingly, over the 2 days. But what I think I just wanted to briefly say to you this evening is that, in a way, although there are particular things that you can do that will facilitate Socratic questioning, I personally think if you can get the attitude right, then the attitude will carry you a hell of a long way without necessarily having to fully get into the nuts and bolts of how you frame questions. I think the framing of questions, incidentally, and having ideas about how to frame them is extremely important, because I think that there's sometimes a disconnect between what our attitude is and how we put it into practice in terms of the way we express it. But I think that the attitude is really the most central thing. So there's 3 things that I usually try and highlight as being most central, really, in terms of having the right attitude within Socratic questioning. And the first one is one of curiosity. I think there has to be what I would almost describe as a naive curiosity about the client's experience, about what it is that the client is thinking. And I think it's about trying, can I say, to view the client and what it is they're thinking and experiencing almost with a naive pair of fresh eyes, as if we've never come across this before. And I think that curiosity also breeds a certain degree of mild interest and enthusiasm, which communicates to the client a desire to want to understand where they're coming from on this. Now, I think that most therapists should have something in their DNA, in a sense, which primes them to do this reasonably well. I think that we all as therapists, we've chosen to do the jobs that we've chosen to do. And I think that we all have what I would describe as a voyeuristic fascination with human beings. There's that bit of us which says, oh, tell me more. And I think that's quite important to hold on to. But there are some dangers that we have as therapists. And there's 2 I just want to highlight. One of them is the one I've already mentioned about the desire to educate. We hold quite strong beliefs that we know what a healthy and an unhealthy way is of dealing with the world, of approaching things in the world. And we have, if we're not careful, twitching antennae for when our clients are coming up with ideas which, in a sense, we wish to match with our own template of what is unhealthy, if that makes sense. So actually we have a tendency, if we're not careful, to label. You know, we're listening to what the client's saying and we think to ourselves, aha, developmental abuse, damaged. Those sorts of sort of keywords, which actually, I hate to say it, in a peculiar way, take away our curiosity. Diagnosis is obviously the other one. But any form of shorthand that we use as therapists, and my goodness, we like to use shorthand as therapists, whether it's personality attributes, life events, whatever it is we use, there is a bit of a tendency, if we're not careful, to slot our client into categories, really. And that is the opposite of having that naive curiosity that I've just been talking about. So that's one thing. The second thing, which I think is in a way a common mistake that everybody makes, but which equally applies to us as therapists if we're not careful, is that when we are using Socratic questioning, we really ought to be, as what I would call, as non-assumptive as possible. In other words, to make as fewer assumptions as we can, and to basically do a lot of checking out that what we think we're hearing is what it is that's actually being said or communicated. As I'm speaking to you now, you have to make assumptions about what it is that you think I mean. You have to make those assumptions in order for you to understand or get something out of, you know, this time we've got here together. And as I'm sure you're aware, in all sorts of situations, we get misunderstandings occurring because the hearer assumes that the speaker is saying something when actually they're not. They're actually saying something else. And anyone, for example, who's worked with interpreters will know how this problem gets amplified even further. And that you know, it's just very easy to make assumptions. Now, there's a particular couple of types of question which are used within Socratic questioning specifically to try and act as an antidote to that, an antidote to the tendency that we have to make assumptions. But I think that, as I've just said before, I think to some extent, we also need to recognize that we need to have an attitude as best we can to be non-assumptive before we even start. So there's that. And then finally is the whole thing about being non-judgmental. And by non-judgmental here, I mean two things. I mean, first of all, seeing or viewing the way the client is approaching things as potentially wrong or unhelpful. And the second thing is our great desire to want to try and slip something in. We often think, incidentally, we are either not doing it at all or we're slipping it in under the radar, but actually our clients see it all the time, which is to slip in some sort of suggestion, loaded question about how actually the client might be doing things in a different way from the way in which they're actually doing. So Socratic questioning is again the antithesis of that. Its ultimate aim is to encourage the client to question, as I say, what it is that they think and believe, and to ultimately change it if it's unhelpful for them. But it is not about really guiding the client about how to do it. So the implication of that, obviously, is no problem solving here, no advice giving, and nothing at all really about trying to slip in an idea which our client hasn't thought of in order to try and help them to think differently. So those are the three things. I know that when I mention these to people often for the first time, then the next thought is, well, what the hell is it that I'm going to be doing then? And the brief answer is obviously come along to the 2-day course. But it's basically about gently asking the client questions about what it is they believe, where the first step in this is encouraging the client to actually question those. So if I come back and just give you a couple of simple examples of this before I finish with regards to Fred that I gave you earlier on. So if we come back to that particular belief, which is something along the lines, I can't remember exactly what that was because I haven't written it down, but it was something along the lines of, I bet Fred would be pleased that I can't find what I want here. So my therapist might ask questions like, when you say pleased, what do you mean by pleased? Presumably there is a reason why you think that Fred would be pleased that you couldn't find what it was that you were looking for. Can you just take me through what that actually is? You seem to be assuming that Fred would like you to have bad experiences of some sort, even outside of the discussion time which you've had with them. Is that right? Have I got that right? Or I might ask questions, or my therapist might ask questions like, so is it the case that everybody you know would agree with you that Fred would be really pleased that you couldn't find what you wanted here? Or would some people agree with you, but some people have a different take on it? The people who would have a different take on it, what would their view be on this? And there's a whole series of other questions which lead the client through this. Now, there's obviously a whole series of things that are probably already crossing your mind about this, of which probably fairly high up in the list is the client response of dunno, and what do you do with dunnos? And we will look at that over the course of the 2 days. I'd imagine that there's, for some of you, there is the question of, well, what do you do if the client's beliefs are actually correct? That, Fred does have a lot invested in this particular person having lots of bad experiences. What do you do when someone's thinking is wrong, in inverted commas? And there's a whole series of other things which will crop up that we would obviously deal with and look at and see how you might respond to those when they actually arise naturally with clients. And that's one of the reasons why we're giving over 2 days to not just the basics of this, but also giving you lots of practice and lots of feedback as well on it. So I'll draw things, I think, to a close at that particular point, and I guess I'll throw things over to Julia really to find out whether any folks have popped questions at all into the chat box, or if they haven't, it's your chance to do so now. I'll do my best to try and address whatever ones crop up really. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Paul. I'll give you a couple of minutes to catch your breath and to say well done for finishing almost within the time limits, because Paul has that big problem. He wants to talk for much longer than we were planning for these events. So just while I'm letting Paul having a little bit of rest, I wanted to share my screen with you and just to show you how you find that course which Paul mentioned about. Sharing screen is always such a difficult and tricky thing. Please let me know like that if you can see my screen now. And
we can see a Zoom screen.
Can you see the SDS web page now? Yes.
Yep.
So for vast majority of people on this event, you've already registered with SDS. That's how you received your invitation. But I know some people came through some other ways. So if you want to come to these events in the future, all you need to do is to register here on a blue sign. You see sign up here for SDS Thursdays. So you sign up here and you will be receiving regular invitations to these Thursdays. And the course which Paul mentioned, you go to all courses and you either put Socratic in here and search, and you'll find this Socratic questioning workshop with Socrates sitting there thinking like a thinker. And you see that it's 11 days until the next course, which is now fully booked. And we've opened a new course in January, 27th, 28th of January. It still will be on Zoom. And we will be using Zoom rooms a lot, and Paul will be popping from one room to another and discussing your practice and things like that. So it'll be quite an experiential course. Those who have done 3 days ACT with us worked in that in that setting, and it worked really, really well. So you can still book it with the early bird discount in January, 27th, 28th of January. And another thing I wanted to mention also, if you want to see previous recordings of SDS Thursdays with other presenters, all you need to do is to go to our news and go slightly back. I think it's third page. And you'll find 25th of December, Christmas Day, free materials videos. And there's a list of all SDS Thursdays we've done to date. So you go through the news, find free materials videos, 25th of December, and you've got the list of all the things we've done to date, or you can go to YouTube, look for SDS seminars, and you will have that information there as well. So, and the last thing I want to mention is, can you see that? Yeah, it's our Facebook group. Sorry, this is, yeah, our Facebook group called Therapist Toolkit, Support Resources and Networking. And we put worksheets and videos regularly there as well. So now I'll stop sharing and go back to the questions. Paul, there were lots and lots of questions asking for some examples of Socratic questioning, which you've addressed at the end. So I won't be going through it. I just wanted to say that we are here for 45 minutes. Of course, Paul can't cover the 2 days course material in 45 minutes. So it's mainly to give you some information on the topic. And if you're interested in it, you can come to the course. But we really hope that that limited information which is presented here still can be helpful in terms of shaping your practice. There was a question which I really liked, and it's quite, you've started addressing it. It was a question from Jenny, who asked, what do you do with yes buts? Or is that telling you that you are not being Socratic enough? So what would you say to that, Paul?
I know this is, I'm not trying to get out of this. I think it depends on what follows the yes, but, really. I mean, yes, buts, in my experience, on the whole, tend to follow statements that come from the therapist rather than questions. So, you know, you might ask a question like, I suppose you could get a yes, but in the sense that you might say to your client, does everybody that you know see this the same way? Or do some people see it, but others don't? And they might say, well, most people see it the same way as me. They might say, some people don't see it the same way as me, but that's because they're wrong. So I would return to it, really, and I would say, so there are some people who see it a different way to you, but they're wrong. But although they're wrong, can you just take me through what it is that they say? So I think it's important that I don't, in a sense, I validate the client's perception of wrongness, But nonetheless, what I do want the client to do is I do want the client to give voice to what the alternative view is. And so I would probably, I mean, that would be one particular way of doing it. I think it really depends on what else comes up. I think you probably already know this really within your work as psychotherapists. But to be honest with you, very often when we're with clients, we need to reframe questions in more than one way in order to enable the client to be able to answer them. So my first thought is always, if I've asked a question and it's not going where I hoped it would go, or doesn't seem to be a very helpful question, I would simply attempt to reframe the question in a different way. What I would not be doing is I would not probably be digging too much further on that. So if I'm getting a no answer, maybe to 2 or possibly 3 forms of the question, and it's not going anywhere, then we'll just leave it and move on to something else. You know, I'm not going to dig up. You know, it's the same old story. If you're in a hole and you're trying to find a way out, you don't keep digging. And if you do the same thing all the time that's not working, don't be surprised if it continues not to work. So you just leave it after a period of time and move on to something else. But I wouldn't do that initially. I would look at reframing in some way.
Yes, well, I think what you've said before, Socratic questioning is not one question. It is a number of questions. So if one particular question produces that sort of stuck response, you can always go for a different set of questions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We are at the end of today's session. I hope you don't mind that Paul spoke for a bit longer and I didn't interrupt him. I just wanted to let you know that we are meeting again in November on the 26th of November, and we are inviting and hosting Dr. Andrew or Professor Andrew Reeves. You probably know him as a former chairman, is a chairman or president of BACP, yes? So it'll be a very interesting, hopefully, I've never really worked with Andrew, but it hopefully will be a very interesting evening. He'll be talking of working with suicide and suicidal behavior. So please mark it in your diaries, 26th of November, as always, at 7 o'clock in the evening. And you have a good evening and don't feel lonely. Write to us if you have any questions or suggestions, and we'll see you again soon. Yes, bye now. Bye. Bye. Thank you. Thank you for coming. It's always so good to see you all. Really lovely. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having your cameras on as well. It's always good to see smiley faces and know that we're not alone. All the best. All the best. Bye.